All right, I would like to welcome everyone to the FAME Community Forum 6. You're able to find the handout for today's presentation in the side panel. Questions and answers questions will be addressed at the end. Okay, Sally?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Okay, this is just the basic housekeeping tips, the same things we've been through every single week. You can always go back to them and look at them or whatever. Crystal, go ahead. Keep advancing. You all know who I am, and the next presenter is Tom Knutte, obviously government strategies, and you all are pretty familiar with him, so he needs no introduction. Again, Joe Knutte, he's with Cittix. I never say that word right. Cittix, I guess. Cittix. Anyway, Joe is, thank you, Cittix. He has been around a long, long time also, so he's our second presenter. And we have Ron Holt, who everybody knows also. He's with Rouse Fitz, and it's a long, long name, so I'm going to stop there. His information is at the end also. So our overview today is a little bit of an update from Department of Education. We did get some updates yesterday. Ron's going to talk about COVID insurance claims, the Paycheck Protection Program reminders. We're not going to talk about that much. Just a little reminder because there might be some additional money people should apply for, and then the reminders of how to spend that money. The CARES Act emergency student grants, the recipient institutional grants, which is still to come, Title IX matters, audit deadlines, which we probably don't know any more about than we did before, 90/10 impact on CARES, and COVID-19 impact on composite scores. Tom?
I'll save some of this for as we go through it from the other standpoints and the other portions of the presentation. But we are looking back at the fact that with regard to a couple of key deadlines, we look to the fact that in just a little over 2 weeks from now, all institutions or all interested parties have the opportunity to provide information to the department on their latest notice of proposed rulemaking that was introduced back on April 2nd, which looks at distance education and innovation. The notice of proposed rulemaking is the second of 4 from the negotiated rulemaking that resulted in consensus. So the department gave a rather short 30-day window for responses, in large part given the fact that they anticipated that given the consensus that institutions would hopefully be in support of the proposals. Sally has highlighted once again one of the key aspects of this, which deals with clock hour institutions and, the ability for us to look at program length in favorable ways. We will be putting together, I believe, a comprehensive list of responses, as will a number of other entities. One of the things that I was on a recent webinar and conversations centered around was, given the responsibility or the move to online education in its various forms by all institutions during the pandemic, some of these definitions that are being proposed and further illustrated in the notice of proposed rulemaking are things that schools might want to make themselves or avail themselves to be aware of, even in this abridged or abbreviated time where you're using online or distance education modalities, specifically regular and substantive interaction, synchronous versus asynchronous, some of the differences in the variations on those type of proposals. More so, shifting to the rules of the day or the topics of the day that all of us, we were talking before we hopped online with you, we're getting dozens and dozens and dozens of calls based on the information that was released yesterday. The Secretary put forward new guidance, both on the student side with regard to access to the student financial aid grants, and also now new guidance on the institutional grants. A number of FAQs, 2 of them to be precise, have been posted on the department's websites. We will go over different portions of those two FAQs and the discussion that took place yesterday as we cover additional areas within the call. We do also note that schools are continuing to have circumstances and frustrations with attempting to get everything registered, both from the student financial aid side as well as the institutional financial aid side on grants.gov, and continue to work to try and assist and support and provide guidance for institutions on how to navigate that process. We do know that a number of different organizations will also be putting forward webinars on how to navigate. CQ is doing one on Friday. CSPEN is doing one tomorrow. So if you are still having complications with getting your initial submission in for the student side, I'll encourage you to attend one or both of those webinars because, again, it is a prerequisite, as they stated yesterday, that you have to execute the student submission before you can start to look towards the submission from the institutional side and the award for the grants, for the funding that the institutions can use. I'll probably stop there, and we'll touch as a community and as a team on other key aspects and takeaways from the guidance submitted yesterday when we get to other portions of today's presentation.
Okay, the only other thing we did want to mention was, they plan to open the country back up, and it's a three-phase plan. We don't.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that was at the bottom of the page. Go ahead, Sally.
It's okay. We don't know when and how that's going to happen, and it's going to obviously happen at different times in different states. Just keep in mind that if your school is told that all the schools can open back up again and that you're ready to do that, that you may have to stop doing this temporary distance education and transition back to online. It may be a gradual thing, it may be all at once, but just pay attention to what's happening and whether or not, you're supposed to go back or whether you're still supposed to do safe distancing. It may work out that you can't do safe distancing in your particular industry. So we'll just have to see what's happening with it. But, just don't forget that you may have to transition back. Don't get too comfortable with what you're doing.
And to that point, Sally, when Sally and Ron and Joe and I were putting this together, we have already submitted some of the questions that we would naturally assume that you're going to ask if you've had a chance to look at this three-phase process from the president. The institutions would come into opening, or schools would be a part of opening up in the second phase of that process. And to Sally's point, we've already asked some questions about what about social distancing in terms of this type of circumstance. What are you going to do in classrooms? What do you do with different types of disciplines where the proximity to individuals might cause those problems? And also some of the more generic questions of what are those timelines going to look like for schools to convert back from an online program to a bricks and mortar or to more of the face-to-face instructor delivery. So we've already put a number of those questions in front of department officials. Obviously, they've taken them under advisement and certainly have already responded back that they will attempt to answer those as they get further into the process. But right now, they continue to focus more on the things that we're talking about today, which are the more urgent needs to determine how to access and deliver the student funds, access the institutional funds, and implement the guidance from the March 27th CARES Act, which we still have not seen and are likely not to see on the policy side for at least another week.
Thank you, Tom. Go ahead, Crystal. This is just basic information, and I don't know if we want to talk about their time or go into it in the future. I think we've covered most of it right now.
I think we've covered this. I think there's key points that we'll get to later after Ron covers insurance and some of the other areas.
Great, thank you. Okay, Ron, why don't you talk about insurance claims? I hear that schools are trying and everybody's saying, nope, not eligible for it.
Yeah, so most insurance policies don't probably clearly cover the situation we're in, but I think most businesses, most schools are familiar with the concept of business interruption or BI coverage. It is possible that some schools will actually have a rider on their policy providing for BI or business interruption coverage. However, even if you don't, you should review your policy, look at all provisions to see if you have physical loss or damage coverage. There are some creative theories that have been developed. There actually are some people that have filed lawsuits already asserting various theories of physical loss or damage coverage, such as the idea that the virus may have caused physical damage or physical loss. And so the best thing that we suggest is that you conduct a review of all of your policies, or if you're not comfortable doing that alone, engage counsel that you have and have counsel review it for you. Look at the definitions. Definitions are critical. All the endorsements are critical. We mentioned here looking at the supply chain concept, and supply chain concept is simply the idea that if you were reliant on something that someone was providing to you, for example, if you were a manufacturer and there was a component you needed to manufacture products that you're selling and that component was taken away in the supply chain, then your ability to operate would be interrupted if you were dependent on that. So it's the same kind of concept here. If your ability to operate is taken away, and we know it has been through government orders, then that's interrupted your business. So the issue is whether or not you have business interruption or physical loss or physical damage, and does your policy provide coverage for it. There's no harm in filing a notice. You may be met with, of course, an objection, a denial letter from your carrier, but you at least need to be on record with them. Sometimes there are provisions in policies that will allow the carrier to deny all coverage if you don't act timely. So this first slide simply tells you to conduct a review. You might also consider having counsel look at the law in your state for a definition of what physical loss is in your state. Sometimes there are policy language definitions that could be favorable for you if, for example, there's a provision that says direct physical loss and damage. In that case, the wording of direct it seems to modify only the word physical loss, not the word damage, so that could mean the word damage is broader. So this is just an example that shows you that a review of your policy is important, particularly a review being done by counsel. Note that words like bacteria and organism, while it may sound like the same thing as virus, is not the same thing. Words are really important in insurance policies. As you might imagine, there are scores and scores of cases that have been filed over the language of insurance policies. Insurance carriers do fight quite a bit over whether or not they have to pay out under their policies. That certainly will happen here. We're not encouraging schools that are on this call to get into legal battles with their carriers. All I'm saying is that it's worth your while to at least file notice. Let's go to the next slide if we can. Crystal, if you would advance that. So notify your carrier right away. One thing that might happen is that it's possible, given the impact, the far and reaching impact of COVID-19 on so many businesses, that some legislatures might pass legislation here providing some sort of retroactive coverage under insurance policies. Of course, if they do that, that also will likely set up a litigation battle between the legislature and insurance carriers. The other thing that could more likely happen is that litigation that's being filed around the country, and a case has already been filed in New Orleans, arguing that the fact that droplets from an infected individual who might have been on the premises, for example, of a business, that could be damage, a form of damage to the premises, that cases like that arguing that concept might ultimately result in a favorable precedent. So if you're in a state where a lawsuit has been filed and a favorable precedent comes out, if you filed your notice in a timely manner with your carrier, your notice that you believe you have a claim, then you can sort of piggyback onto that outcome. But you need to get your notice in a timely manner. So document everything. Your policy will dictate what should be in your notice, but generally speaking, it would be outlining information about when you began to suffer damage, and that would be when the government orders in your jurisdiction were issued that required you to basically shutter your business and move to an online form of operating, and the effect of doing that, the loss of revenue, the expenses that you incurred. You would provide projections. In most policies, you're not required to actually give an exact statement of what your loss was. I think that covers everything we need to talk about right now on insurance. Unless we have questions later, I think we can move on.
Thank you. Okay, so we talked about the Paycheck Protection Program last week, and this first slide was pretty much standard. We went over. We are expecting another $250 million, hopefully.
Actually, Sally, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that figure was put in there at a point in time when we expected $250 million. The bill that passed the Senate by voice vote yesterday, I believe, has $310 million in it. Is that right, Tom? That's the number.
That's correct. 310.
So, yeah, and it has yet to get through the House. Is a vote expected tomorrow or today in the House? Do you know, Tom?
Thursday.
Tomorrow. They are not in session in the House today. Next time they come back in pro forma session is tomorrow. There is still some conjecture over whether or not Republicans will try and push, as Democrats did last time, for an actual quorum for votes. It is likely that that will not end up happening, and it'll be a voice vote because everybody is very much aware of how much these funds are needed. So it is likely to be passed through the House tomorrow, and if it's like the original CARES Act was, likely to be signed by the President tomorrow or early Friday as well. We can talk about some more of the details as we go through. Go ahead, Sally and Ron.
Thank you very much. So the first page was basically to remind you that if you have not put in an application for these funds, do it now. Because if your application's already in and there's more funds available, you have a much better chance. I know there's
the burn rate
a lot of applications out there.
They project that these loans will maybe be gone in 3 days.
Right.
That the burn rate would be over $50 billion per day. So you're right. Get your application in right away.
And one of the things that's happening here in D.C., and you've seen it in the media, there is a great deal of concern about the fact that larger organizations and franchisees and the like that intended, than were necessarily intended, have gotten portions of the PPP funds, and many of them are returning those funds. So it could be that there is additional money to get us beyond another 3 to 4 day hurdle. But Ron and Sally, you're both absolutely right. If you already have your proposal in the queue, again, keep it there. Do not necessarily, even if you were considering making revisions, don't do so, because you'll go to the bottom of the sorting pile. And these funds are certainly being distributed, being determined and distributed very quickly, even as banks and others have considerable pressure on them.
Yeah, so if you have 500 or fewer employees, you would qualify if you've been impacted by, COVID-19. And of course, if you're a school and you've had to shift quickly to an online environment, we know you've been impacted. There is a certification in the application that you've been impacted, and you do it under penalty of perjury. But and we have lawyers in my firm who specialize in this, and we've had some people that have worried about it because they didn't feel like maybe they had been impacted right away. But by now we know that everybody has been impacted, and I doubt that very few people have to worry about that part of the application, being able to certify that they've suffered economic impact from COVID-19.
One clarification I wanted to make is that if you haven't applied yet, you need to contact your banker today. Some banks are not even taking applications right now. They're saying they're going to open up in a couple of days once this legislation passes. You need to be very, and the way the banks are doing it is they're gathering the information, and then they're actually doing the submission. So you've got to be in contact with your actual banker or a representative of your bank that will ultimately be reaching out to you. You need to have that done today. If you don't do that within the next 24 hours, you're probably banking on hoping that they do a third, which they may do, but you're basically going to be out of this next batch as well. So you need to contact your banker and get the representative and get the application ready.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to the next one, Crystal.
So, Sally, this slide, like we talked last week, reminds people of how the proceeds says must be used, and it must be used in terms of forgiveness. So if you want the loan to be forgiven, you've got to use 75% of the proceeds for payroll. Now keep in mind, you have an 8-week period from disbursement to use the proceeds, but you can actually be paying payroll today, and it could be back pay. In other words, you could be hiring people back after you get your loan dispersed. So you apply today, and let's say you get the proceeds next week, a week from today after you applied. You could actually be paying people that you hired back who had been laid off for 2 or 3 weeks. You could be paying back pay as of next week, handing them a check for paying them for being laid off for 3 weeks. That's okay. We believe that's permissible under the statute and under the guidance that's been issued by the SBA. So that would be okay to pay the payroll that way, or you could be paying it over the 8-week period that you have from the point the loan is dispersed. If you do it that way, use the proceeds 75% for payroll and then 25% for the other items on that slide: rent, interest if you own your own building, interest on a mortgage, and utilities. And then the other bullet point there is business loans, and they would most likely be other SBA loans that existed as of February 15. Then it would be forgivable. If in fact you don't use it exactly in those percentages and exactly for those items, then what will happen is not all of those amounts will be forgivable, and it will transform into a loan that you have to pay back. You'll have 6 months of grace before you have to begin paying it back. It'll be a 2-year amortization with a 1% interest rate, so it's still not so bad. However, if you want to, you can prepay the loan all at once as well. So those are the basic concepts.
Thank you, Ron. Crystal, go ahead. So that's the forgiveness he was just talking about. I think you pretty well covered everything in there.
Yeah, that just tells you that in order to get the forgiveness, you've got to match the amount of people that you have on your payroll to the benchmark. The benchmark is what your payroll was like in the preceding year. If we go back to 2019 and look at the spring of 2019, we have to be able to compare that to what you're doing now in the spring of 2020. So there is a benchmark comparison. And then this example just gives you an example of that. If you had a baseline or a benchmark of 300 employees a year ago and you have 300 employees now, you borrow $4 million, you spend the $4 million on payroll, then all of the $4 million will be forgiven. So it's basically free money if you use it in accordance with the 75-25 breakdown. It's free money, and it puts your people back to work, and it's a great plan for taking care of people.
Joe, did you want to add anything?
I know a lot of people on this call are struggling with the fact that some of the people were on unemployment, and now they got to take them back on. Once is established that the stay-at-home, like we're essential businesses, so once the schools reopen, and I know we're still waiting for guidance on social distancing and how you actually reopen and go back to business as usual, but assuming it does, those students, they're not going to have a choice. I mean, your employees won't have a choice. I mean, they can't choose to stay on unemployment. I know this is a big issue with a lot of schools, and it's that trying to get that workforce back in while it's safe, because you do have this 8-week window to spend those monies. So that's going to be a challenge that we'll address on a school by school, institution by institution basis with their employee staff.
Right. Okay, so the next we just talked about last week, and again, it just has the basic for the CARES Act emergency grants. It does not have the Q&As. So we do need to talk about the Q&As a little bit. we've got the 1, 2, 3, 4th bullet down there that talks about the funds directly to the student. And it says all programs, including short, non-Title IV, get rid of that. I thought I updated that page, apparently not, or maybe Crystal doesn't have that update. Anyway, our problem is if you looked at the Q&As yesterday that came out, it is question number 9. Wants to know what students are eligible to receive emergency financial aid grants. And it basically says only students who are or could be eligible to participate in programs under Section 484 in Title IV of the Higher Education Act. So basically you're looking at students that might be cash paying in a Title IV program, but you'd have to know that they would be eligible to still get money. So in that case, you would have to look at, would they be eligible to file? Would they meet all the eligibility criteria? Should you have them fill out a FAFSA to make sure they'd be eligible? Because they could be subject to verification or anything else. Originally, it was thought, I went to like 3 different webinars that all said they thought it only applied to the DACA and the international students, like the I-20s that might not be eligible and they weren't sure. But that does not seem to be how this currently reads. Does anybody disagree with my interpretation?
No, I agree with you, Sally.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a Title IV eligible student, which would sound like a Title IV eligible program as well.
Agreed.
Tom, you still agree?
Agreed.
Okay, so delete that. When we post this on the website, we will get rid of that. And then the other big one, I think, was there was a lot of questions out there about, could you use the money that you spent on laptops for the students? And these funds have to go directly to the student when you're talking the student grant money. So you have to be sure that that money goes directly to students. You cannot post their account with any money that they owe you. Again, this is student grant money, goes to the students. Anybody have anything else that you thought was really important on that one yesterday? Oh yes, the other one is if you have, this is a one you have to watch out for. Some of you may have had some students online and some students on ground in the same programs. If the student was already participating online, then those students are not eligible for these funds. It was strictly for the students that had to transition over. So that may make things a little more complicated when you're dispersing funds.
Yeah.
But that still does leave funds available for hybrid students. What the department made clear and continues to try and make clear is that students who didn't have any conversion issues because they were already all 100% online would not be eligible for the funds.
Right. So was anybody that had to, go through new technology, go through that learning curve of doing distance ed versus strictly a brick and mortar situation?
They keep relying on the use of the terms, and they pull them from the statute, disruption of campus operations. So again, there has to have been something that changed in order for this to be student eligibility and that carries over to the institutional side that we'll talk about here in a little bit as well.
Right.
Sally,
yes.
And one other thing to emphasize is you can't use these funds, the emergency student grants, to reimburse yourself for money that you've been paying out to student workers. So, like if you've been got a student on the payroll and maybe under the federal work study program and you provided a match, an institutional match, you can't use this money to reimburse yourself for that match. We've talked about that before, that you were allowed to take money or actually waive the institutional match if you wanted to, but you can't, if you're matching, you can't go ahead and use this money to reimburse yourself. They emphasize that.
All right, thank you, Ron.
And-
There was about 90-10, but we'll talk about that at the end.
The other question that may be relevant and the frequently asked questions, number 10 referred to the registration for the second funding source, the link. And it's the exact same process as the first one, other than, as Tom, you noted earlier, that you have to be registered for the student portion of the funding before you can get the recipient institution portion. But that actually is going much, much, much smoother on the second part. It's a lot easier. So for those of you on the phone who think the second portion is going to be the same laborious task that you had to set up the first one, it's a lot easier.
Yes. So the next slide that we have up is basically just reminders. Again, we talked about most of this last week. You know, write your policy on how you're going to disperse the funds, whether or not you're going to reserve some for professional judgment. Some people are doing a questionnaire to just ask students, you know, what their financial situation is, if they've lost jobs. Others are just doing it equally across the board. Some are determining the neediest students by, I'm sure, EFCs. It doesn't matter what you do as long as you have a policy and you follow it. Those are the most important things. It can be used for any portion of cost of attendance, which includes room, board, food, health care, child care, course materials, laptops, internet. But you have to give the students that money, and then they can use it for course materials. Don't post the account card for any books, supplies, tuitions. Keep good records. This is going to be so important. This is not the time to get sloppy. Document, document, document everything. So go ahead, Crystal. Tom, you want to talk about this, or you want me to? Who? These are
I think we'll all chime in some portions of it. The other key point of what happened yesterday, as stated here on this slide, was the first release of guidance and information and recognition for institutions on the institutional side of the HERF, as we call it. We live in the world of acronyms. Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, HERF, and an FAQ that Joe and Sally and Ron and I have all been alluding to or referring to as well. It's a 4-page document that has a list of 10 questions as well, an FAQ, and it talks about, once again, the institutional side. The department, I think, acknowledged the fact that institutions were clamoring, would be a nice word, for the guidance and the opportunity to have access to the funds to help them, meaning you, the institution, as well as the students, and have done what they could to move as quickly as they could with prudence, but also with processes as well to give access for institutions to draw down on, or have access to draw down on the institutional side. Key points that are different: while you cannot use a number of the student funds for some of the areas that we talked about previously, the institution can use portions of their funds for some of the things that we had requested, or the institutional community had at least inquired about, from trying to get relief for payments made to students. And the guidance specifically talks to, as Ron and Joe and Sally and I were just speaking of, on the student side, you can use the institutional side to reimburse yourself as an institution for laptops or other things that you purchased. I think that it's important to point out that they put a date on this from May 13th or forward. So you're starting to see the time parameters wrapped around a number of these grant and aid assistance programs, to know where I think that the policy guidance is going to go when they talk about things like R2T4 reimbursements not being required for students during the emergency. Some of these timelines, I think, are going to emerge in those future documents. What is important, I think, in some of the takeaways, and I'll share this with others to give their 2 cents, but the ones that were, I think, stood out to me were the fact that the institution does have the ability to use the institutional side to reimburse themselves for those key costs that they couldn't pull from the student side, those being room and board, tuition, and other fees can be pulled from this institutional accounts, as can, as I said, the purchase of laptops and other information technology. I'll stop there and let some of the others share their points of view.
Yeah, Tom.
Go ahead, Ron.
I had one of our attendees text me with a question. What we have up on our slide is about laptops for instructors and staff, and one of the attendees that was asking, what if we bought a laptop for a student? And the Q&A covers that as well, but again, as you said, with the date of March 13. So I think if you bought the laptop before March 13, before the President's proclamation of a national emergency, you wouldn't be able to use this money, the institutional portion, to reimburse yourself. But if you bought it after March 13, then you would be able to use the money to reimburse yourself.
I concur.
Yeah, I would agree.
I know the one thing that we're waiting clarity on, everybody wants to hear about, is that the clamor is that there's a tremendous administrative cost to delivering, the emergency grant to the students, which i.e. would be your time, probably labor. As of right now, that's very, they were pretty specific yesterday about no bonuses to owners or to high-level staff. So they did spell out some things, unfortunately, yesterday. They were very clear about not using any of this money for advertising, marketing, and so forth. So we are waiting for clarity on whether or not administrative costs to deliver the emergency grants to the students will be a factor.
Well, I think, Joe, I think the only thing you're going to get from the department, to be very clear, is that you are allowed to utilize the institutional funds for the continuation of the operations of the institution on the institutional side of the grant funds. But you're absolutely right, and they pulled directly from the statute the very clear guidance that, as is highlighted on this slide, that you cannot use any of the funds for payment to contractors for pre-enrollment related activities and recruitment, which certainly includes marketing, recruiting, and advertising. It does spell out as part of one of the Q&As the difference and the distinction the department does make between when you have an entity that provides both management services as well as marketing, recruiting, and advertising. I think it's number 8, and it says specifically that they can use the funds to pay the per student fees for a third-party entity, an online program management type entity that provides both the distance learning platform or the LMS and also does student recruitment. But you have to distinguish between the LMS or the operations side and the marketing side, and you can pay for the operational side, but it once again says very, very clearly that you cannot use it to pay for marketing, recruiting, and advertising and other forms of enrollment related issues. So that, I think they addressed that concern, and unfortunately, when it comes to the statement of what the funds can be used for, they were very clear that you can use it for normal payroll and the like, but as you said, not in any way, shape, or form for bonuses or, again, any recognition that, yes, while there may be an administrative process to go through the development of the submission of the application and the disbursement of these funds, they don't look at that as something that should be given any incentives or any funding.
Thank you. Go ahead and change the page, please. Okay, go ahead, Ron. I think this is your information.
It is. So this is Title IX matters, and I may have my colleague Chris Knutte to join me on this. So first of all, wanted to bring to your attention the fact that while we've been dealing with some of these other more important issues with the transition to online and the way Ed has relaxed some of our operating rules and gotten money to us. At the same time, Ed has been addressing Title IX, and this first slide here contains some of the bulletins that have been issued. The first one up there at the top is a civil rights fact sheet that was put out on March 16, and then the next bullet point down on March the 4th. And this, it was addressing the fact that there's been a lot of talk, of course, about the virus emanating from Wuhan in China, and at times it's been described as the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus. And unfortunately, there are people in our society, in our country, who have taken descriptions like that as an occasion to engage in acts of harassment toward people of Chinese or Asian descent. So the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, has put out a statement about the need for colleges to be vigilant about any actions that they become aware of on their campus involving harassment and bullying directed at students of Asian and Chinese descent. And just reminding you, as this last bullet point on here points out, that if you become aware of actions like that, they are in fact violation of federal statutes, a number of statutes, including Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Next slide, please. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Title II of that act also prohibits discrimination, in this case disability discrimination, and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. And then once again, Section 504 of Title VI specifically requires schools that receive federal funds, and of course that would be all of the schools that are on this call, when they become aware of a situation involving bullying or harassment, to investigate what occurred, to respond to a report of bullying or harassment, and to determine whether or not remedial action should be taken. Next slide. And Crystal, could you, thank you. So if your investigation, and of course you're operating virtually now, and it's less likely that there would be bullying or harassment happening virtually, but it could have started before you transitioned online. And if you've been made aware of that, even in a virtual world, we're aware that there has been cyber stalking, cyber harassment, so you would still need to respond to any complaints that are brought to your attention by any of your students, and you would need to make an effort to bring an end to that if it's continuing. And depending on how you're operating virtually, whether you have, for example, synchronous sessions that are being conducted with Zoom, Skype, or other platforms, you would need to make sure that any offending student who's been conducting any kind of bullying or harassment is appropriately disciplined, and document that so that any victim of those actions doesn't feel reluctant to participate in those synchronous sessions. And failure to do this, of course, would be a violation of Section 504 and of Title VI, and then you yourself, the institution, would be subject to action from the OCR. And of course, this is all familiar stuff. There's nothing new here in these bulletins that have been issued by the OCR and by the Department of Education. It's just a reminder that Title IX still needs to be observed and followed by institutions, notwithstanding the fact that we're operating with a lot of other constraints being imposed on us by COVID-19. Next slide, please. And Chris DeLuca, who specializes in this, and he's my partner, he may jump in from time to time. I think he's on the call, logged in as a registrant. Disabilities.
Wait a minute, Ron. Crystal, do you have to unmute Chris DeLuca, or can
Yes,
he unmute?
I have unmuted him.
Thank you
Yes,
very much.
I'm here. Hopefully you can
Okay,
hear
good,
me.
Chris. Welcome.
Good. Thank you.
The point here on disabilities is that the department, when they issued this guidance on April the 3rd, wanted to emphasize to schools that you shouldn't hesitate to try to provide some kind of online education, even though you might have difficulty providing accommodations for students that have disabilities. Students that, for example, are hearing impaired, and you're going to provide synchronous education as opposed to asynchronous, and it's going to be, conducted, let's say, with Skype or Zoom where there's audio, and maybe you don't have some way to accommodate readily hearing impaired students. You're not necessarily, quote, off the hook. You're still obligated to try to provide academic adjustments, auxiliary aids, and services, as this slide says, and make whatever reasonable changes you can do without an undue burden or without fundamentally altering the nature of the education. So you should examine that and keep in mind those obligations, but don't say, well, I'm just not going to do anything online because I don't know how I would accommodate those students I know I have with disabilities. Next slide, please. And this slide provides you with, an email address that you can use to seek advice, and also there's a short video available at this YouTube location. But the idea is that you should examine what means you could use to accommodate students that you have in your enrollment that do have disabilities, and what means of access you could provide them for participating in the online environment that wouldn't have been, as much of a challenge for them if they were in the on-ground environment. And Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. It's general in nature, but it's just the idea that you need to be sensitive to how the transition to online has impacted students in your population that have disabilities.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is it also highlights one of the just general issues regarding access to students with disabilities, and there's been, and that is related to your website access. And that's something that even before the transition to online education, and that's something where you need to understand your responsibilities for making sure that your websites are accessible under the ADA, and so now certainly as you're transitioning to an online education experience for your students, is a good time to be looking at that as well, and making sure that even post-COVID-19, when things get back to normal or as close to normal as they can, that's something that you're thinking about too, and making sure that you're compliant going forward.
Thank you, Chris.
Next slide, please. So you're all familiar with the obligation, I hope you are, in our audience, under the Clery Act, to provide a notification when there's an immediate threat to health or safety. And the department also, as part of the, I believe it was the April 3 guidance, informed schools that they weren't required to give ongoing COVID-19 updates, even though COVID-19 as an infectious disease would fall within this language under the Clery Act, a significant emergency or dangerous situation involving an immediate threat to health or safety of students. It's adequate that you provide a single notification about COVID-19. You can do that through whatever regular means you have of communicating an emergency notification and providing a CDC link that is a link to the CDC website. And if you want, you can use a banner on your website for that purpose to accomplish that notification. But I would say at the same time, even though it may seem like it's almost an unnecessary and sort of beside the point kind of notification. It's something you should do if you haven't done already. So make sure that's on your website. I don't know how closely the department's going to monitor that, but provide that information so it's there for any student that wants to look at it. Then this next slide that we have up here right now reminds you that if you have Title IX complaints that are being made right now or that had been made prior to COVID-19 becoming part of our life, you do have a duty to make your best efforts to continue the investigation and, if appropriate, adjudication of those complaints. So even though you've moved your instruction, in many cases for the first time temporarily online, those Title IX obligations that you have as an institution are not suspended. And these bullet points remind you that Title IX prohibits sex discrimination in education programs, and that sex discrimination includes sexual harassment, which includes sexual assault, and that this is a form of sexual discrimination banned by Title IX, and that sexual harassment can create a hostile environment that interferes with and limits the student's ability to participate in and benefit from educational programs and services. Next slide, please. And so even though it seems less likely for that to happen when we're operating online as we are now in many cases for you temporarily, you still need to continue your investigation. Again, as I mentioned earlier, for some of you, for example, cosmetology schools, you're operating perhaps in a synchronous environment online through Zoom or Skype or other platforms, and if in fact there was a complaint made by a student being harassed by another student, they may feel uncomfortable participating in that synchronous model, knowing that that other student may be part of it. So there's a very real element to harassment perhaps continuing. You have an obligation to, I think, continue the investigation in the ordinary course in a reasonable manner and try to resolve it in a timely manner. And adjudication should happen in the ordinary course pursuant to your policy. Now that means, virtual interviews. And some schools do that already to separate people so they're not together in the same room. But virtual interviews and perhaps even a virtual hearing if it can't be scheduled without, too much passage of time, and who knows when lockdowns are going to be lifted. And I'm going to let Chris comment on that, whether waiting another month would be appropriate or not. But again, we come back to that element of a student who says, I'm a victim, I've been sexually harassed or assaulted, and my offender is another student, and I don't want to be in a Zoom session with that other student being part of it. I don't want to see his face, and I don't want to participate if I know he's going to be part of it. It's standard accommodation, standard remedial action for a school pending the outcome of an investigation to accommodate a student like that. I think it's on our next slide, to accommodate a student and separate them. That's particularly true for schools that have, residential environments. They're supposed to separate students so that they're not, put through that sort of psychological stress and harassment. So Chris, why don't you step in and add your view on that as well, what a school should do when they can't have a physical hearing and we don't know how long COVID-19 is going to last, and you have a student who's uncomfortable and doesn't want to participate even in an online environment with that alleged offender out there.
Well, and there's a couple of points to that, and so and it's very similar to the situations where even we're back physically in school, but the principal thing is what's here at the top of the slide, and this is the current standard. Now, there's been expectations for a while now that we're going to get new Title IX regulations and what that standard will be under those new Title IX regulations. And we've seen, what the proposal was, and there's been a lot of pushback on that. But based on Secretary DeVos's guidance from 2017, this is where we are now. And we underlined it, italicized those four words in the middle there, because that's the triggering event. So whether the student files a complaint of sexual misconduct or not, if the school knows or reasonably should know of an incident of sexual misconduct, the school needs to take steps to determine what occurred and to respond appropriately. And so basically, once you know, you're on the clock. So whether whether we're physically in school or we're in temporary distance education right now, once you're aware of it, you've got to do something about it. And so that's looking into how do you respond to that, and what measures do you take, because it's a balancing act from the standpoint of, if somebody submits a complaint, then you need to treat that complaint with respect and to respond appropriately to it. So so you've got to take that allegation and do the right thing with that. Having said that, the respondent to that, the accused student, if you will, they have rights as well, and making sure that you protect their rights. They've got a right to defend themselves, to know if there's somebody who's filing a complaint and wanting to take some action that's going to affect the respondent in this case. Well, that respondent's got rights as well, and making sure that he or she is treated appropriately and given an opportunity to respond to the allegations. So it's that balancing act, and it's going to depend on facts and circumstances. It's going to depend on, and what kind of makes it a little bit murkier as well is that there's this concept of, well, this is all happening outside of school. We're in remote learning. Everybody is at home. It's happening off campus. Why is that my responsibility? And that's a fair question. But the challenge here is that under Title IX, and again, the guidance that we've got now, where we are today, is that even that generally schools aren't responsible under Title IX for incidents that occur off campus. However, if that off-campus incident has the effect of creating a hostile environment on campus, and I would say on our digital campus, our remote campus now, even though it's an off-campus event or incident, if it has the effect of having potentially creating a hostile environment within this new distance education environment, well, now the school does have an obligation, even though it's an off-campus incident. So it's going to depend on the facts and circumstances, and there's a lot that goes into how to respond. The big thing is, though, and the important message is you have to respond, and you can't just say, well, we'll get to it later, because later might be 30 days from now, it might be 45 days from now, and if that's going to have an effect on the learning environment over the next 30 to 45 days, that's problematic.
Wow, thank you both, Chris and Ron. I think most of us have been so tied up with all the COVID-19 stuff, even though Title IX does matter, we've kind of let it slip to the back of our mind, not in front. So I'm glad you gave us those reminders.
Well, and you don't think about it being off site, but again, when you think about cyber stalking and you hear these reports about Zoom bombing and people coming into school Zoom sessions and some of the stuff they're posting that's truly awful, it's a challenge. It's something you wouldn't think would be a challenge and we would need to be addressing, but we do.
Absolutely. Thank you. Crystal, next slide. Okay, so Joe, we know we don't have any deadlines that have been extended, but just give people again the heads up on if we don't get extensions and we can't get our audits done, what's going to happen?
Sure. So right now, all forms of government, obviously we have the Internal Revenue has done extension. There's been other extensions, so it hasn't been determined whether or not they're going to extend it. For those of you who have December 31st calendar year end, they have not affirmatively said. I've been in some discussions. The fact of the matter is that it looks like there's going to be an extension, but sometimes it's even assuming that the extension goes out to September, you got to make sure there's no accounting issues that like there's some issues with debt that will not be extended even with an extension, so there may be an impact on your audit. All that to say is, if I had a guess, there's going to be an extension, but there's nothing right now, so it's full engine ahead to timely submit your audit.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead. Thank you. So anybody that wants to talk about this, go ahead. I know we did have a Q&A on this last one.
I can kind of jump in on the 90/10, and feel free to interject if anybody's got thoughts on this. But you know, obviously we're still awaiting some guidance. I think we all know that the first monies that are used for the student, which I like to say those are cost of attendance monies anyway, which don't count currently under 90/10, right? Because they're not revenue.
Right.
We report those on our audit report, but we also then take them out, so it's a non-factor. So clearly that money then becomes a non-90/10. The PPP loans used for payroll will be excluded. That's pretty clear on the slide here, because they're going to be forgiven, hopefully. And if they're not forgiven, they're not revenue. They end up being a loan if they are on the onset. So the PPP will not have an effect on the 90/10 calculation. So unknown, the R2T4 refunds retained by the school will be treated. It's a cash basis calculation. So obviously if you make a refund, you're definitely going to be able to reduce your Title IV paid out. Right now, the guidance is pretty much that you can defer payments, but the guidance doesn't say that ultimately you might not have to pay that money back. So during this period of time, it was done to alleviate cash flow issues with schools that are affected by COVID-19. Sally, you made a good point, and you probably want to reiterate. These R2T4 refunds that are being retained by the school have to be COVID-19 related. It just can't be, you have to have documentation that identifies that those refunds were the result of a COVID-19 issue. Is that how you, I just want to make sure that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know that you made a good big point, and I took note on my record to make sure that we emphasize that again. The emergency institution loans or grants, it says will be considered EFA on here. That's
any money that the institution may have given the student as a grant or loan before we had any grant funds and loan money eligible for other purposes.
correct.
So like institution went ahead and gave the student a loan or a grant to help them get through the tough times, that's now going to be considered estimated financial assistance because it's institutional aid, not federal aid.
Yeah, to EFA, the estimated financial assistance. Thank you for clarifying that. And then lastly, it says, will the CARES grant to students become taxable income in 2020 year? So that the grant to go to students are not taxable because that's to the institution because you're giving that to the students.
So you don't think that'll become taxable? I had some questions.
Are you talking about the money that we're giving and that we're putting in a separate account to distribute to students?
Yeah.
Yeah, that will not be taxable. That's student. It's
All right, cool.
no different than the money that you currently get for cost of attendance that we give to students.
All right.
And the other thing, I don't know if this was mentioned earlier, but just to clarify, on those monies that are going to students, we need to track those money to who we're giving them to, and we need to send out a plan, and there'll be requirement to give that money back to let the government know who received those funds. But in terms of how the student ends up spending the funds, we don't have any responsibility once we notify them what they can spend it for. So there'll be no tracking of what the students are spending that money for. We inform them what they can spend it for, and then that's their responsibility.
Right. Go ahead, Crystal.
Next slide. Composite scores. All right, so ultimately the composite, this COVID-19 event, in the event that we don't get any clarification, it's sickage, we're going to be evaluating what the impact of COVID-19 is, and it will be an extraordinary event. So we'll have the discretion of allocating the impact with our audit client, what the impact is so that we can separate that out on an income statement. I know in the past that when there's been a national disaster emergency declared area, which all 50 states fall under, there's been relief on the composite scores in the past. So I think the most recent one would have been maybe, I know Katrina was probably the biggest one and that I can think of. And those people were relieved of, if you were in the impacted area, of the composite score. So we're thinking that's going to be the same guidance. So what does that mean? That basically means that you still have to have an audit, you still have to calculate a composite score, but the consequences of a failing composite score would be delayed until an audit period that wasn't affected by the disaster. Now this is just based on previous action taken by the Department of Education with previous issues, most notably Katrina.
Thank you.
We're still waiting for guidance. I know, Ron, you'd sent a email out asking about 90-10 composite scores and audit deadlines, and I think they said they're definitely making it a priority to get back to us. You haven't heard anything subsequent to that request, have you?
No, I sent that to Undersecretary Diane Jones and Assistant Secretary Bob King, and they said they were making it a priority. But as this slide says, there was a DCL, a Dear Colleague letter issued in 2017 that related to Hurricane Maria and the other hurricane that occurred that year. I've forgotten the name, but that the one that really ripped up Puerto Rico. And I know schools in Puerto Rico, I represented at least one down there, were able to gain relief from putting up a letter of credit or being subject to sanctions for deficient composite scores because they were able to show, well, A, they were not operating for many months, as you can imagine, because the school buildings were, closed and torn apart, and then B, even when they did get up and operating again, it took them many months to recover economically. So they were granted relief, and that Dear Colleague letter basically said they would be granted relief if they could demonstrate a connection between storm impact and their economic situation. And that was the whole purpose for it. So when there's a national emergency declared by the President under the Stafford Act, the Secretary would have the discretion to grant schools relief in a number of different ways. There's a lot more in that Dear Colleague letter than just talking about economic impact, but my interpretation of it is that it does include composite score relief. And I think that Ed will come through and say that. But if I were a school, I would be hanging my hat on this Dear Colleague letter. I don't know, Joe, how you and your firm look at that or what Tom thinks of that, but that's certainly my view of it.
Yeah. We're definitely going to carve out the impact in the event that something isn't formalized and we were to issue an audit. We would definitely have an extraordinary event to lessen the blow of to the income statement at a bare minimum. Before we would release anything, we're going to put as much pressure as possible to get clarity on that. But in the interim, we aren't going to wait. We have a plan to help schools with some relief on the composite score.
I think the precedent and the fact that we were able, and individuals like yourself, Ron, and others, were able to dig this up and remind the department with the background and the precedent of prior events is certainly going to help, I hope, with them, easing them into making the determination that you just discussed.
I agree. Okay, Crystal, I think we might be toward the end. Yes, it looks like we're at the end. That's our resources. Do you know FAME has a resource page? I want to add one thing. We get a lot of questions about, how do we get this money? Once you've submitted your information, you will get a grant notification. Send that grant notification through a ticket into FAME, and then we know that those funds will be coming down. So we do have a process in place. Contact customer service if you're not sure what to do, etc. But I hear everybody saying, oh, my application's in. How do I know I get money? When is the money come? We don't know when the money's coming, but at least if your application got in, that's a start. Better than a lot of schools. So Crystal, I cannot, go ahead one more screen. I think that'll put contact information. Yes, that's everybody's contact information. And I cannot see any questions.
Okay, so I do have a question here. How do I journalize the CARES Act fund once I receive it? Should I consider it as other income or a payable? This payable decreases every time I use the funds.
Joe.
Yeah, that's an easy I can answer that one. So remember I would put it as a liability account and then reduce that liability as it's expended, or especially the student portion. You'd have the student portion, so that actually is almost like a separate account, right, where you have the money comes in and you have a corresponding liability, but that should always match with the cash is, because the money should only be expended for students. So it'll have no impact on your income statement.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next question is, how do cosmetology schools do social distancing?
It's going to be hard to tell. I think they're going to have to decide, can they, I don't think you're going to be able to have a clinic for a long time if you want to know the truth. It's just a personal opinion, because that's pretty close contact. You could probably get back into your facility and have your students be at workstations, because those are usually not on top of each other. But if you have a very small area in there, you may not be able to get back for a while.
That's a question, the question related to cosmetology. I imagine that the forefront is going to be maybe big industry employers may be able to share what they're doing, right, in terms of what they're advising their local salons, and you could maybe gain some insight on that. I would reach out to industry representatives as well. They got to be coming up with some kind of social distancing ideas so they could stay operational, right?
Yeah, but I don't know what to tell you, what the answer is to that.
Okay, our next question is it true that they want us to submit for our institutional portion when they still have my student portion coded as quote unquote tracking number assigned?
I think you can go ahead and submit once your application's been accepted. So if you've got a tracking number, it's been, assigned and they're tracking it. Those are going to be separate applications, so you're obviously not going to get the other funds yet.
The term that the department used was executed. So if you have done everything and you are at the point at which you're waiting for conversations or the follow back from from grants.gov and from the department, yes, is my understanding from a conversation held with Department of Ed officials earlier today, that is the executed. It means you've submitted. It does not mean you have received. It means that you have done all of what is required of you as the institution to complete the process for the request for the acquisition of the funds.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Next question. NACIS has indicated we cannot do both TDE and a soft opening where we have students on campus. Can you confirm this?
I cannot confirm anything for NACIS. You will have to talk to Dr. Miranda.
Okay. Can you reiterate the webinar that is happening this Friday that can help navigate grants.gov with submitting certification for the student portion of the CARES grant?
There are two of them. One is tomorrow with CSPEN, my organization, the 501c3, and another one from CQ on Friday. I can share with Sally the information on both of those, and I'm sure Fame can get it out to you all.
I'm not sure. Does CQ require you to be a member, or are they doing it for everybody? I am not sure, Sally. I thought it was open to the public given the it could be. I'll have to check.
But you're absolutely right. I don't know that for absolute certainty. but we can
Yeah,
reach out and
I'll check the
certainly
website.
request, and it is available on the CQ website. That was where I was trying to head to.
Right, thank you.
Next question. We filed with our insurance company and they sent back a letter of denial. Should we do anything now?
Well, if you have a denial letter from an insurance company, at this point, your option would be to file a coverage action against the insurance company, or to simply wait until something develops in your state in the way of a coverage action by another company and a favorable precedent. You have a period of time, depending on the statute of limitations in your state, which is probably somewhere between 2 and 3 years, to file a claim. You probably want to talk to counsel to get some guidance on, how long that time period is and what your options are, and, how strong of a potential claim you have.
Thank you. In the letter from Betsy DeVos yesterday, she stated that only 50% of colleges have applied for the grants. Do we know the percentage of beauty schools that have applied?
No, I don't think we have any way of knowing that. I think the problem is all types of schools are actually having problems navigating the whole website and getting in and finding their SAM's ID information, and then discovering that their SAM's ID and their DUNS number that they're using are different, and there's a whole litany of issues out there.
I found it humorous on the call yesterday, and she did a fantastic job. I'm very thankful for the secretary, did a great job, but she talked about
The word seamless.
She used the word seamless, and then the subsequent, was it Diane, Tom, who then subsequently said, sorry for the bumpy road. So a little bit of a juggle on the baton handoff there.
Yeah, again, folks, there is everything from, look at this from the good side. There is a lot of cleanup that has been done by institutions as a result of this, making sure that the information that you have on your e-cars and what you have in terms of SAM and DUNS numbers and other things are accurate. We all have our day-to-day operational issues and things that we've been doing, and certainly those things kind of fall to the wayside. So a lot of schools have had the benefit, and I am looking at this as the glass is half full, to use this as an opportunity to make sure that all of that information that they maybe haven't looked at in a while is now current and accurate. But there are several steps to this process and forms that have to be completed. I know now, because I've been walked through it 4 times over the course of the last 24 hours, you have processes to complete with the SAM's number if you don't already have one, and even if you do, to get the verification, to then go through the cage process and get an additional verification where you'll get a temporary passcode. There are ways in which you get frustrated because you type in the temporary passcode that you literally just got and it won't take it. But if you log out and log back in, or if you and then say forgot my password and type it in, it'll launch. So there are tricks to the trade to do this, and I've seen it and walked through it. We at C-SPAN have, like I said, I've spent the better part of the tail end of last week and this week putting together a slide presentation, which I'll be happy to share with FAME, that walks through the steps-by-steps that we've got. It's some 48 slides with screenshots. I'm doing a conference call on it with PAPSA, so you Pennsylvania members will be hearing a conversation on it literally at 3 o'clock this afternoon, where I'll walk through the slide presentation with them, and then maybe we'll look to do, Sally, another one through FAME. Now that there are at least, I've worked with Arizona, the West Coast, and the East Coast with individuals who have been able to successfully complete and taken all of their information and a number of screenshots, clean them up, and at least I think have a pretty cogent way of showing you how to go through the steps prior to grants.gov, the eBiz processing that you have to then go through before you even literally go back into ed.gov to grants.gov and actually submit the application with all the forms.
Thank you, Tom.
Hey, Sally, a quick shout out. I mentioned this last week call, but I know that I've been on at least 10 hours of call, people trying to get registered. I feel like I'm, without ever having done it, I've done it numerous times. But kudos to a lot of my clients and colleagues out there that have jumped on calls to help other schools. So I feel like in times like this, and before you go on a call, go through the process. When Tom's saying stuff like the EBIS, POC, and the AOR, you have an idea what that's like. So if there's glitches that you have or things that you're struggling with, I mean, there's a lot to intake on a call when you haven't even gone on the website yet. It's a lot to get done, but 50% of the people have gotten it done. So, and there's people out there that are willing to help you, but you really do make the most use of your time when you've done some exploring on your own before you get on the phone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. Are we required to use the funds from the PPP program right away, or can we hold them until we get back to school? What would happen if we held the funds until the return?
I would refer you specifically to question number 7 on the proposal for the institutional portion. Let me read it in its entirety just so I think it answers your question. Many institutions are using funds from the recipient institutional costs to award scholarships or to provide payments for future academic terms. May institutions do those things? Here's the department's official response. It depends. Under Section 18004C of the CARES Act, it expressly states the funds for recipients' institutional costs are to cover costs associated with significant changes to the delivery of instruction due to the coronavirus. Institutions may also use the funds for recipients' institutional costs received through the HERF under that same section and another section to make additional emergency aid grants to students, provided that such emergency financial aid grants are not for expenses related to are for expenses related to disruption of campus operations due to COVID. Again, what you've heard all of us talk about. Here's what I think is the relevant part. As long as awarding scholarships or providing payment for future academic terms are costs associated with significant changes to the delivery of instruction due to the coronavirus, or if provided to students in the form of additional emergency financial aid, are for expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to the coronavirus, such uses are allowable.
Great, thank you. All right, our next question, how does back pay work for those who may have received unemployment benefits while laid off?
I'm assuming that the individual is asking this question in order to try and meet with the terms of the Payment Protection Act. Ron and Joe, help me with this one. Sally, I believe that you have to first bring the individuals back online. It doesn't say that you have to provide back pay. It does say that you have to be equal or equivalent at the time at which by June 30th, I think it was, you have to be back to where you were prior to the emergency and then utilize those funds going forward. I don't think it prohibits you from using them for back pay, but the focus is on utilization of those funds to sustain operations going forward.
Ron, you had mentioned something about back pay. Did you want to clarify that? I can jump in.
Ron, do you have something further? Take yourself off mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Tom. I was on mute. Yeah, I think the issue of back pay would be a question of what you as an employer feel would be appropriate relative to what an individual collected in unemployment benefits while they were laid off. So, how did the unemployment benefits compare to what they would have earned while they would have been employed? And I know in some cases, there's actually the opportunity to receive a higher level of compensation. At least I've been told that by at least one school owner that I've talked to. So I suppose you wouldn't be making a back pay payment to somebody who already has been compensated through unemployment compensation at a higher level than what they would have received if they've been working on the job. But that's something you'd have to evaluate. But we had a client who also told us that they were going to pay back pay to employees who they were bringing back, and I don't know how they evaluated the unemployment factor there or not, because some states do have a waiting period, so individuals haven't necessarily been compensated for all days of unemployment, and that's another issue that you would evaluate is, have people been made completely whole for the time that they've been off the job, and if they haven't and you want to make them whole, you can, but you're not obligated. My point in telling everybody earlier on the call that they could pay back pay was simply that you're not prohibited from using part of the CARES Act funds to make payroll payments that would represent a time period prior to the date on which your loan was funded. And in fact, you're allowed to do that to make these employees whole. That's one of the things you're allowed to use the funds for.
Sure. Just to,
Do you not agree, though, Ron, that it still kind of hovers around that May 13th forward date?
March 13th.
March 13th, sorry.
Yeah, agreed with that. I think, yes, Tom, I think the one thing to be careful about here is I think what people are struggling with, Tom and Ron, and correct me if you feel differently, but they want to make sure they expend all the money that they've been allocated. And, they're ramping up their people. And if someone is getting unemployment for the period of time that you're doing back pay, you're going to run into a problem that way. Now, is there going to be overtime? Is there going to be different ways to make sure you expend this money because it's going to be needed? When you come back up in operation, it's going to be kind of crazy at the beginning. There's going to be a lot of techniques. I would make sure that anything that you do that you seek a third party to just kind of run your ideas through. I mean, worst case scenario, you do something, that money's going to be disallowed and you're either going to have to pay it back or it's going to be converted to a loan. In any event, I'd want to know that I'm following the rules all the way along. And there are some techniques. I can tell you that I think back pay is fine, but it's not going to be fine if the person's already been compensated through unemployment.
Right, exactly. And that's why I was saying, and look at whether or not they've been made completely whole by unemployment. And if they haven't, because there were days that weren't covered by unemployment, you want to pay for those days, you can do that. And I think it's a great idea to talk to counsel or talk to your CPA, talk to an advisor before you make that decision. By the way, you like you said, Joe, you can prepay these loans at any time. There's no penalty, obviously. So if you use half the money and you have half the money that can't be used, you can return it. And then you're judged on the half that you did use, and that affects the percentages.
Okay, thank you. So we have one more question based on our remaining time. Unfortunately, we were not able to get to all the questions during the webinar. But our last question we can address, can we disperse funds now before the funds come in?
I don't think so, not under the Paycheck Protection Program. I think that the 8-week period begins, the way the statute is written and the guidance from the SBA, it begins from the point that the funds are dispersed to the school. So I don't think there's any way that you can be actually using funds you haven't received. I realize you can take your own money and say, I'm using my own money and I'm going to reimburse myself, but not the way the statute's written. The 8-week period for using funds runs from the date of disbursement.
I believe they're asking that question from the side of the emergency relief funds, the HERF funds. The guidance is very, very clear that if you would not be able to use any portion of the 50% that goes to students if you choose to do that. You could do that, the way I read this, for the institutional portion and then reimburse yourself out of the institutional portion for those funds, but not from the student side.
And you don't think they would become an institutional grant if they forwarded the money?
Well, but it says you're allowed to do that, Sally. That's what the whole question that we just reviewed on scholarships or for future academic terms. You have the capability to do that. Once again, as long as it's related to funds that go to this, when you're giving to the students in advance because of the disruption of the campus operations due to coronavirus, or because they, again, or because that they were a scholarship for an academic term for the cost related, again, related to significant disruptions.
Yeah, you can reimburse yourself for making those sorts of grants.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification.
I've got two things. I had a question from someone. Can schools enroll new students during this time period? I don't think the guidance from Ed has changed on that. You can enroll them for payment periods up through June the 1st, correct, Sally?
That's correct.
That's correct.
And the second thing I have is a short rap to share that we didn't do earlier. Do we have time for that?
Yes.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. You're still training up America, not letting the virus take that away. You're still training up America for work that soon is going to pay. You're teaching for careers, but also sharing strength for what we face by being there for your students, extending some peace and hope and grace. You're training up America on the coast and in the plains, from LA to New York and Arizona up to Maine. You're teaching with Skype and Zoom. You're reaching out to everyone with skills for new careers and hope for better days to come. You're training up America on what matters every day, like saying what you mean and really meaning what you say. You're teaching with your head, but sharing passion from your heart, because you know it takes commitment to be ready from the start. Yeah, you're training up America because education is the key to living out plans and dreams God has for you and me. You're training because our nation wins when each of us succeeds in our work and in our lives and in our thinking and our deeds.
Thank you, Ron. All right, guys, thanks so much for being on. Crystal, thank you for your assistance. And everybody stay well and healthy and safe, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.